332 BC. A 24-year-old king stands on a beach, staring at an island he cannot reach. No ladders work, no ships he trusts. No siege in history has ever looked like this. The people mocking him from those walls have never lost a war in their city's entire existence, and they've just thrown his murdered ambassadors into the sea to prove it. Most commanders would turn back. Alexander orders something no one has ever attempted: pour the mainland into the ocean, stone by stone, until the sea simply isn't there anymore. 7 brutal months, 2 burned siege towers, an underwater knife fight, and 1 furious king later, the Mediterranean had a new coastline, and Tyre had stopped existing. By the summer of 332 BC, Alexander of Macedon had already accomplished more than most kings managed in a lifetime, and he was still only 24 years old. 2 years earlier, he had crossed from Europe into Asia with an army that, by the standards of the vast Persian Empire he intended to conquer, was almost absurdly small, somewhere in the range of 40,000 infantry and cavalry, facing an empire that could theoretically field hundreds of thousands of soldiers across its enormous territorial reach. He had already won 2 of the most consequential battles in ancient military history, at the Granicus River and then at Issus, where he had personally routed the forces of the Persian great king Darius III and sent him fleeing from the field. Victory in open battle, however, was not the same thing as conquest, and Alexander understood something that many conquerors before him had learned at great cost. An army that marches deep into enemy territory while leaving powerful, hostile forces intact behind it is an army marching toward eventual disaster. The Persian navy, one of the most formidable maritime forces in the ancient Mediterranean world, remained entirely unbeaten. Its greatest strength came not from Persian sailors themselves, but from the Phoenician cities along the eastern Mediterranean coast. Cities like Sidon, Byblos, and most significantly, Tyre, whose maritime traditions stretched back centuries and whose fleets formed the backbone of Persian sea power. Alexander had a strategic problem that pure battlefield genius could not solve. He intended to continue his campaign southward into Egypt, seizing that wealthy Persian territory before eventually turning east to hunt down Darius and finish the conquest of the Persian heartland. But if he marched south while the Phoenician fleet remained intact and loyal to Persia, that fleet could sail behind him, land troops on the coast of Greece or Macedonia itself, stir up rebellion among the Greek states that had never fully reconciled themselves to Macedonian dominance, and cut Alexander's supply and communication lines with his home territory. The solution, as Alexander saw it, was as elegant in concept as it would prove difficult in execution: eliminate every Phoenician port city's capacity to operate independently, and the Persian navy would have nowhere to base itself, nowhere to resupply, and would effectively cease to function as a strategic threat, regardless of how many ships it still possessed on paper. One by one, the great Phoenician coastal cities had submitted to Alexander as his army marched south along the Levantine coast. Byblos opened its gates without significant resistance. Sidon, one of the oldest and most prestigious of the Phoenician cities, welcomed Alexander's forces and even assisted him, its own long-standing rivalry with Tyre, making an alliance with the young Macedonian conqueror an attractive proposition. The pattern seemed to be repeating itself smoothly, city after city recognizing that resistance against Alexander's forces, fresh from 2 overwhelming battlefield victories, was likely futile. Then Alexander's army reached Tyre, and everything changed. Tyre was unlike any of the cities that had preceded it, and understanding why requires understanding the peculiar geography that had made this city one of the most secure fortified positions in the entire ancient world. Tyre existed, in a sense, as 2 cities in one. There was Old Tyre, situated on the mainland coast in the ordinary manner of most ancient port settlements, but the heart of Tyrian power, wealth and defence lay roughly 800 meters offshore. on a rocky island that rose from the Mediterranean Sea, like a fortress that nature itself seemed to have designed specifically to be unconquerable. The island city was ringed by massive stone walls, and on the side facing the mainland, the direction from which any conventional land-based attacker would need to approach, those walls reportedly rose to a height of nearly 150 feet, an almost unimaginable barrier for any ancient siege technology to overcome, even under the best of circumstances. But height was almost the least significant of Tyre's defensive advantages. The simple fact of the water itself, that 800-meter gap of open Mediterranean Sea separating the island from the mainland, rendered virtually every conventional siege technique that ancient armies relied upon completely useless. You could not build siege towers on solid ground and roll them up against walls that sat surrounded by water. You could not dig tunnels beneath fortifications that had an ocean for a foundation. You could not simply surround a city and starve it into submission when that city controlled the surrounding waters with a navy that no attacking land force could match. And Tyre's navy was, without exaggeration, one of the most capable maritime forces anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world. Phoenician shipbuilding and seamanship traditions had developed over many centuries, and Tyrian ships effectively controlled the waters surrounding their island home, giving the city both a defensive barrier of open water and an active military capability that could contest and defeat any approach by sea. Alexander, surveying this situation, faced an uncomfortable truth. He commanded one of the most formidable land armies ever assembled, built around the legendary Macedonian phalanx and supported by exceptional cavalry. What he did not command was any meaningful naval force of his own. His fleet consisted of ships contributed by Greek allies of uncertain loyalty, nowhere near sufficient to challenge Tyre's navy in open combat, and Alexander harbored justified suspicions about whether Greek crews would fully commit to battle against fellow experienced Mediterranean sailors. This was the strategic puzzle Alexander confronted as his army approached Tyre in early 332 BC. How does the greatest land army in the ancient world conquer an island fortress it cannot reach, defended by a navy it cannot defeat, ringed by walls no siege engine could approach? Alexander's initial approach was remarkably diplomatic by his usual standards. Rather than immediately threatening violence, he sent envoys with a modest request, carefully framed to test the city's intentions without provoking open hostility. He wished, he informed them, to enter the island city to offer sacrifice at the great temple of Heracles, known to the Tyrians as Melkart, one of the most important religious sites in the Phoenician world. A temple Alexander, who cultivated an image of himself as a descendant of Heracles, had genuine religious and propagandistic motivations for visiting personally. It seemed like a request a wise city council might grant without serious cost. The people of Tyre, however, understood exactly what such a request actually represented, and their response would set in motion one of the most extraordinary military engineering campaigns in the history of ancient warfare. The leaders of Tyre understood precisely what Alexander's seemingly modest religious request actually meant, and their response revealed both their political sophistication and, ultimately, a catastrophic miscalculation about the character of the young king they were dealing with. Allowing Alexander's army, or even Alexander accompanied by any significant armed escort, onto their island would represent a profound symbolic and practical surrender of the very independence that made Tyre one of the most proud and self-sufficient cities in the entire eastern Mediterranean world. An armed force permitted onto the island, even under the pretense of religious observance, could never be fully trusted to simply perform its ceremony and depart peacefully. The Tyrians, drawing on centuries of political experience as one of the oldest and most successful commercial powers in the ancient world, recognized the request for what it actually represented, a test of their submission, dressed in the language of piety. Their response was calculated to thread a difficult needle, refusing the request without issuing what they might have hoped would be interpreted as a direct, unforgivable provocation. They informed Alexander's envoys that he was welcome to perform his sacrifice to Heracles at the ancient temple located in Old Tyre, on the mainland, where the original and arguably more historically significant shrine to the god actually stood. The island city itself, however, would remain closed to him and to any armed Macedonian presence. For most ambitious conquerors of the ancient world, this response might have represented an acceptable compromise, a face-saving arrangement that preserved honor on both sides, while avoiding a costly and uncertain military confrontation over what was, after all, fundamentally a matter of ceremonial access rather than substantive strategic value. Alexander, however, was not built from the same diplomatic material as more cautious rulers. His entire self-conception, cultivated since childhood under the tutelage of Aristotle and reinforced by every military triumph he had achieved since crossing into Asia, was built around an almost obsessive relationship with concepts of honor, glory, and the total uncompromising nature of his ambitions. The word neutral, as later historians and even his own contemporaries would observe, held essentially no functional meaning in Alexander's personal vocabulary. Every relationship, in his understanding of the world, was ultimately binary, total submission, or total opposition, with no meaningful middle ground that a truly great conqueror could accept. Tyre's calculated compromise, intended as a reasonable accommodation, was received by Alexander as a direct challenge to his authority. He responded by demanding Tyre's complete and unconditional submission, leaving the proud island city no acceptable path between total capitulation and open war. The Tyrians had genuine reasons to believe they could resist even a conqueror who had, up to this point, proven himself unstoppable. Their walls made any conventional land assault unthinkable. Their navy remained one of the most capable maritime forces in the Mediterranean. And critically, Tyre maintained close ties with the Persian Empire, whose resistance against Alexander's invasion remained a real and ongoing concern. Darius III had not surrendered, and continued to command substantial resources across the Persian heartland, meaning Tyre's alliance with Persia represented a genuinely rational bet that outside assistance might yet arrive. What followed transformed a difficult but conventional siege into something approaching a deeply personal war of vengeance. When Alexander dispatched additional envoys to Tyre, the Tyrians made a decision that would prove catastrophic for their city's fate. Rather than simply refusing entry, as ancient custom regarding ambassadors demanded even between hostile powers, the Tyrians seized Alexander's representatives, killed them, and threw their bodies from the city's walls into the sea. This act cannot be overstated in its significance. Throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, the sanctity of ambassadors represented one of the most deeply held customs governing relations even between bitter enemies. Killing an ambassador was understood as a violation that transcended ordinary warfare, forfeiting any claim to the protections defeated enemies might otherwise expect. The Tyrians, in murdering Alexander's envoys and then casting their bodies into the sea as a deliberate insult, had transformed a strategic disagreement over ceremonial access into something Alexander would now treat as demanding total, uncompromising retribution. Ancient historians, including Arrian and Diodorus Siculus, consistently describe Alexander's reaction in terms suggesting genuine personal fury rather than merely calculated response. He reportedly swore, before his assembled commanders, that Tyre would be utterly destroyed for this act, its walls reduced to nothing, its very existence erased from the world. This was no longer simply a strategic problem requiring a clever solution, but a matter of personal honor that made any outcome short of Tyre's complete destruction unacceptable to him. His senior commanders expressed genuine, well-founded skepticism about how such a siege could possibly be conducted successfully. How could any land army hope to besiege a city surrounded by open water, defended by walls towering beyond the reach of any siege equipment, protected by a navy Alexander's own forces could not match? Alexander's response revealed the particular quality of strategic imagination that separated him from virtually every other commander of his era. If the fundamental obstacle was the water separating mainland from island, then the solution, however unprecedented, was conceptually simple: eliminate the water itself as an obstacle. If it is an island, Alexander reportedly declared to his doubtful commanders, then we shall build a causeway and make it part of the mainland. What followed would become one of the most extraordinary feats of military engineering the ancient world would ever witness. Translating Alexander's audacious declaration into an actual functioning military engineering project required an almost immediate and comprehensive mobilization of resources, manpower, and raw materials on a scale that few ancient military campaigns had ever attempted for a purely engineering objective rather than a direct military confrontation. The scope of what Alexander was proposing deserves genuine appreciation. He intended to construct, using essentially the technology and labor methods available to any ancient Mediterranean army, a solid causeway stretching the full 800 meters separating the mainland from Tyre's island fortress, wide enough and sturdy enough to eventually support siege towers, battering rams, and the assault troops needed to actually breach the island city's formidable walls. The first and most immediately available source of raw material for this enormous undertaking lay literally within sight of the construction site itself. Old Tyre, the mainland settlement that Alexander's forces had already occupied without significant resistance, contained substantial stone buildings, temples, and structures that had accumulated over many centuries of continuous habitation. Alexander made the pragmatic and, in a sense, symbolically resonant decision to systematically demolish these mainland structures, using their stone as the foundational material for the causeway that would eventually connect that same mainland to the island city that had defied him. Buildings that had stood for generations were torn down, their stones broken and hauled to the water's edge, where they would form the initial foundation layers of what ancient sources describe as an engineering project unlike anything previously attempted in the historical record available to us. The human resources Alexander committed to this undertaking were similarly extraordinary in scale. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers and laborers, drawn from across Alexander's substantial army, along with local workers, and likely a significant contingent of enslaved or conscripted labor from the surrounding region, were organized into the kind of massive, continuous labor operation that few civilizations before the modern era could have coordinated successfully. This was not merely a matter of assigning soldiers occasional construction duties between military engagements. It represented a sustained, primary military and economic effort that consumed enormous resources and demanded organizational sophistication matching anything Alexander had demonstrated on any actual battlefield. Beyond stone, the project required enormous quantities of timber, and Alexander turned to one of the most storied resources of the ancient Near East, the legendary cedar forests of Lebanon, whose massive, durable timber had been prized for millennia, used in everything from the construction of Solomon's Temple to Tyre's own formidable navy. Thousands of these cedar trees were felled and transported to the site, driven into the seabed and packed with rubble around their bases, providing the foundational stability that prevented the growing causeway from washing away under Mediterranean waves and currents. The initial phase of construction proceeded with remarkable speed, likely encouraging both Alexander and his previously skeptical commanders. The water immediately offshore was relatively shallow, and the combined labor force made rapid progress driving pilings and extending the causeway outward. advancing what ancient sources suggest was roughly a meter or more per day during these early, favourable stages. The Tyrians, observing this effort, initially responded with a mixture of astonishment and derision. Tyrian ships would sail close to the advancing construction, their crews shouting insults at the labouring soldiers below, reportedly calling out sarcastic questions, asking whether Alexander now considered himself greater than Poseidon, the god of the sea, given his apparent presumption that he could simply overcome the ocean through sheer determination. Alexander's response to this mockery revealed something significant about his leadership. Rather than directing operations from a comfortable distance, he reportedly descended personally to the construction site on multiple occasions, working alongside his soldiers in moving stone and timber, demonstrating through his own participation that he considered this engineering effort every bit as important as any battlefield engagement. This kind of visible shared sacrifice carried genuine motivational weight among soldiers who might otherwise have grown demoralized by weeks of exhausting, unglamorous labor conducted under the mocking observation of an enemy that remained, for now, entirely beyond their reach. The initial success of the causeway, however, would prove to be merely the opening phase of an increasingly difficult challenge, as the physical realities of what Alexander's forces were attempting began to assert themselves in ways that would test both engineering ingenuity and sheer determination. The shallow waters near the mainland would soon give way to considerably deeper and more treacherous conditions, bringing engineering challenges and enemy resistance that would push Alexander's plan to what many, including within his own army, would come to genuinely doubt could succeed. As Alexander's causeway extended further from the safety of the shallow coastal waters near the mainland, the engineering challenges facing his construction crews multiplied dramatically, transforming what had begun as a straightforward, if labor-intensive, construction project into an increasingly complex battle against both the natural forces of the Mediterranean Sea and the deliberately hostile actions of an enemy that had begun to recognize the genuine existential threat this advancing structure represented to their continued independence. The waters surrounding Tyre deepened significantly as the causeway progressed beyond its initial, relatively straightforward foundation phase, eventually reaching depths that ancient sources suggest approached 18 feet or more in the more challenging sections closer to the island itself. This increasing depth created immediate and serious structural problems for a construction technique that had proven perfectly adequate in shallower water, but now faced the much more demanding physics of maintaining stable, load-bearing structures against significantly greater water pressure and more powerful current action. The Mediterranean's natural currents, which had posed relatively minor complications during the causeway's early construction phases, now began actively working against the entire project, steadily eroding and washing away the rubble, packed earth, and smaller stones that construction crews were attempting to establish as a stable foundation for the growing structure. This natural resistance from the sea would have represented a formidable challenge under any circumstances, but Alexander's forces now faced this problem while simultaneously contending with an enemy that had finally recognized the existential danger this advancing causeway represented. The Tyrians, whose initial response had consisted largely of derisive mockery, now understood with growing alarm that Alexander's seemingly absurd ambition was steadily advancing toward genuine completion, and that completion would mean the end of the geographic isolation that made their defense seem so secure. Tyrian naval forces began launching increasingly aggressive harassment operations against the exposed construction crews working at the advancing edge of the causeway. Fast Tyrian vessels approached the unprotected workers, their crews unleashing devastating volleys of arrows against laborers with no meaningful defensive equipment. These attacks proved genuinely effective, forcing workers to repeatedly abandon their labor and seek cover, bringing the entire project to what ancient sources describe as a near-complete standstill. Alexander responded with characteristic engineering ingenuity, ordering the construction of two massive siege towers, each reportedly reaching heights of approximately 150 feet, designed to be moved into position at the forward edge of the causeway, providing both an elevated firing platform and physical protection for the crews working nearby. The tower's exterior surfaces were covered with fresh animal hides to protect against fire arrows, and heavy torsion-powered ballistae were mounted atop them, allowing Alexander's forces to strike at harassing Tyrian vessels and force them to maintain a more respectful distance. This combination of defensive and offensive capability succeeded, at least temporarily, in restoring security to the construction effort. The towers represented a mobile fortress advancing alongside the causeway itself. Alexander's consistent pattern of responding to obstacles with increasingly sophisticated engineering solutions, rather than accepting any limit to what determination and capability could accomplish. The Tyrians, watching these towers advance, were far from finished. Having witnessed the effectiveness of Alexander's countermeasures, the defenders began developing a considerably more ambitious and ultimately devastating response, one drawing on their deep maritime traditions to strike a blow that would prove, at least temporarily, catastrophic in reversing months of accumulated Macedonian progress in a single afternoon. The commanders of Tyre, observing Alexander's massive siege towers advancing along with the causeway toward their city's walls, understood with growing urgency that conventional harassment tactics alone would prove insufficient to halt what was becoming an increasingly successful and dangerous engineering achievement. What was needed, they concluded, was not merely continued disruption of the ongoing construction work, but a single, decisive strike capable of destroying months of accumulated Macedonian progress in one devastating action, buying Tyre additional time and, they hoped, potentially discouraging Alexander sufficiently that he might reconsider the viability of his entire audacious enterprise. The plan the Tyrians ultimately developed represented a genuinely sophisticated piece of ancient military engineering and tactical planning in its own right, drawing on their city's extensive maritime traditions and technical expertise to create a weapon specifically designed to exploit the particular vulnerabilities of Alexander's massive but inherently flammable wooden siege towers. Tyrian engineers took an older vessel from their substantial fleet, one presumably considered expendable given the extraordinary purpose to which it was about to be dedicated, and transformed it into what amounted to a purpose-built incendiary weapon, a floating instrument of deliberate destruction specifically engineered to inflict maximum damage on Alexander's causeway and its protective towers. The old ship's interior was packed with an extensive combination of highly flammable materials, carefully selected to ensure the most intense and sustained conflagration possible once ignited. Dry timber, various forms of pitch and resin, sulfur, and substantial quantities of oil were loaded into the vessel's hull, creating what amounted to a floating bomb of accumulated combustible material. Beyond this substantial cargo of incendiary substances packed within the ship itself, Tyrian engineers suspended large cauldrons and containers filled with additional flammable materials from the vessel's yardarms and rigging, positioned in such a way that these containers would spill and spread their burning contents across a wide area upon impact, maximizing the destructive reach of the resulting conflagration well beyond the immediate point of initial contact between the fireship and its intended target. Having prepared this elaborate incendiary weapon, the Tyrians then exercised the kind of patient, calculated timing that reveals genuine tactical sophistication rather than merely improvised desperation. They waited for a day when favorable wind conditions would carry their prepared fireship directly toward Alexander's advancing causeway and its massive protective towers, understanding that success depended not just on the ship's incendiary preparation, but on natural conditions cooperating to ensure the vessel actually reached its intended target, with sufficient speed and directional accuracy to achieve maximum destructive effect before Macedonian defenders could react effectively to the approaching threat. When suitable wind conditions finally arrived, Tyrian sailors towed and then released their carefully prepared fireship, guiding it toward Alexander's siege towers with the specific intention of achieving direct contact between the burning vessel and the massive wooden structures that represented such a significant investment of Macedonian labor, resources, and engineering ingenuity. As the vessel approached its target, and its crew had accomplished their essential task of positioning the ship for maximum destructive effect, the Tyrian sailors aboard set their own vessel ablaze, then abandoned ship, diving into the surrounding water and swimming to safety, leaving behind a fully engaged, rapidly intensifying fire that continued its now unstoppable trajectory directly toward Alexander's prized siege towers. The resulting collision and subsequent conflagration proved every bit as devastating as Tyrian engineers had intended. The blazing vessel struck directly against Alexander's massive wooden towers, and the intense fire, fed by the substantial quantities of oil, pitch, and other flammable materials the Tyrians had so carefully prepared, spread with terrifying speed across structures that, despite their animal hide covering, intended to provide some protection against exactly this kind of incendiary attack, ultimately proved unable to withstand such a concentrated and sustained fire assault. Both massive siege towers, representing weeks or months of accumulated construction effort and consuming enormous quantities of increasingly scarce timber resources, were completely consumed by the resulting flames, reduced to smoking ruins within a relatively short period of intense burning. Compounding this already severe setback, Tyrian forces used the chaos and confusion created by the burning towers as cover for launching additional direct attacks against the causeway structure itself, with soldiers and sailors working to physically dismantle and destroy portions of the carefully constructed roadway that Alexander's forces had spent so many months laboriously building outward from the mainland. The combination of the devastating fire that had consumed the protective siege towers and this follow-up physical destruction of the causeway itself represented a catastrophic reversal of Macedonian progress, undoing in the course of a single, carefully orchestrated day significant portions of an engineering achievement that had required months of continuous, exhausting labor to accomplish. For Alexander's army, and quite possibly for Alexander himself, this represented one of the most significant setbacks encountered during the entire siege, a moment when the fundamental viability of his audacious engineering strategy might reasonably have been called into serious question. Ancient historians recording these events do not shy away from acknowledging the genuine severity of this reversal, describing an outcome that left Macedonian forces watching helplessly as their carefully engineered solution to Tyre's seemingly impregnable island defenses went up in flames before their eyes. The accumulated labor of many weeks reduced to smoking wreckage floating in the waters between the mainland and the still defiant island city. This dramatic Tyrian tactical success, however brilliant in its conception and however devastating in its immediate execution, would ultimately prove to represent merely a temporary setback rather than a decisive turning point in the overall course of the siege, precisely because it failed to account for perhaps the single most consistent and significant characteristic that had defined Alexander's military career up to this point: an almost preternatural refusal to accept that any setback, however severe, represented a genuine and permanent obstacle to his ultimate objectives. Where a more conventional commander might have looked upon the smoking ruins of his siege towers and the damaged causeway and concluded that Tyre's defenses had proven genuinely insurmountable, Alexander's response to this devastating reversal would instead demonstrate the particular combination of stubborn determination and creative strategic adaptation that had already carried him to victory over seemingly impossible odds on multiple previous occasions, and would now be applied with even greater intensity and sophistication to solving the problem that Tyre's clever and genuinely effective fireship attack had just so dramatically demonstrated, remained very much unsolved. The devastating success of the Tyrian fireship attack and the accompanying physical destruction of significant portions of the causeway that Alexander's forces had labored for months to construct might reasonably have convinced a less determined commander that the entire audacious engineering strategy had proven fundamentally unworkable, that Tyre's seemingly impregnable island position had successfully demonstrated its practical invulnerability to even the most creative and well-resourced siege efforts available to ancient military technology and organization. Alexander's response to this significant setback, however, revealed precisely the quality of relentless strategic adaptation that distinguished his generalship from that of virtually any other commander of the ancient world, ancient or otherwise. Rather than abandoning the causeway strategy entirely, or even scaling back his ambitions in response to this costly reversal, Alexander instead ordered his engineers and laborers to rebuild the structure on an even more ambitious scale than before, constructing a causeway that would be significantly wider than the original design and reinforced with additional engineering innovations specifically intended to address the vulnerabilities that the Tyrian fireship attack had so effectively exposed. This expanded causeway would provide greater structural stability against both natural erosion from currents and waves, and against the kind of deliberate destructive attacks that had proven so devastating to the initial, narrower construction. Among the engineering refinements Alexander's forces incorporated into this reconstruction effort was a more sophisticated approach to stabilizing the causeway's foundation against the erosive action of Mediterranean currents that had proven such a persistent problem throughout the earlier construction phases. Workers began incorporating entire trees, complete with their branch structures still largely intact, positioning these elaborately branched timber structures vertically within the causeway's foundation in a manner specifically designed to trap and hold accumulating sediment and smaller stones in place, creating a more naturally stable and current-resistant foundation than the simpler stone and rubble construction techniques that had characterized the original, less successful design. This reconstruction effort, however substantial and technically sophisticated, represented only one component of Alexander's revised strategic approach to finally overcoming Tyre's stubborn resistance. The devastating fireship attack had taught Alexander a lesson that extended beyond mere questions of causeway construction technique, driving home a more fundamental strategic reality that his advisors had been emphasizing since the earliest days of the siege. No amount of engineering ingenuity applied to the causeway alone would ultimately prove sufficient to overcome Tyre's defenses so long as the city retained unchallenged control of the surrounding waters through its formidable navy. Alexander needed, quite simply, a navy of his own, one substantial and capable enough to challenge Tyrian naval supremacy directly, rather than merely defending against Tyrian naval harassment from fixed, vulnerable positions along an advancing causeway. Acquiring such a naval force represented a formidable challenge in its own right, given that Alexander's kingdom of Macedonia possessed no significant maritime tradition or shipbuilding infrastructure comparable to the great Phoenician and Greek naval powers of the eastern Mediterranean. Rather than attempting the impractical task of constructing an entirely new fleet from scratch, Alexander instead pursued a more pragmatic diplomatic and political solution, traveling personally to the nearby city of Sidon, itself one of the great Phoenician maritime powers, and, significantly, a long-standing regional rival of Tyre, whose own commercial and political interests had frequently found themselves in competition with Tyrian dominance of eastern Mediterranean trade routes. Alexander's timing for this diplomatic mission proved fortuitous, arriving as it did at a moment when his previous military successes throughout the region combined with the increasingly apparent determination and resourcefulness he had demonstrated throughout the ongoing Siege of Tyre, had begun to convince various regional powers that continued allegiance to the Persian Empire represented an increasingly poor strategic wager compared to accommodation with what appeared to be an unstoppable rising conqueror. The King of Cyprus, along with numerous other Phoenician cities that had previously maintained at least nominal loyalty to Persian authority, began reassessing their political alignments in light of Alexander's evident military success and Tyre's increasingly precarious position. This shifting political landscape yielded Alexander exactly what his engineering efforts alone had proven unable to secure: a substantial and immediately available naval force. Cyprus contributed a fleet of approximately 90 warships to Alexander's cause, while various Phoenician cities, quite possibly motivated by some combination of genuine political calculation and simple opportunistic desire to see their historical rival Tyre humbled and defeated, contributed an additional 80 vessels to the growing Macedonian naval force. Combined with whatever ships Alexander had already possessed prior to these significant new contributions, his fleet now numbered over 200 warships, a force substantial enough to genuinely challenge Tyrian naval supremacy for the first time since the siege had begun. This dramatic and largely unexpected acquisition of substantial naval power fundamentally transformed the strategic calculus of the entire siege, representing perhaps the single most consequential development in the whole extended campaign against Tyre up to this point. Alexander, who had begun this engagement possessing an unmatched land army, but essentially no meaningful capacity to contest control of the sea that protected Tyre's island fortress, now commanded a combined force capable of threatening the city from multiple directions simultaneously, fundamentally undermining the geographic advantages that had made Tyrian resistance appear so genuinely formidable throughout the siege's earlier phases. The psychological impact of this development on both sides of the conflict deserves particular attention. For Alexander's forces, who had endured months of exhausting, often dangerous construction labor, and had witnessed their significant engineering achievements literally go up in flames through Tyrian tactical brilliance, the sudden acquisition of overwhelming naval superiority must have represented a profound and genuinely morale-boosting transformation in their circumstances, evidence that their commander's seemingly stubborn refusal to accept defeat, however difficult and costly the path forward had proven, was ultimately vindicated by developments that finally provided the comprehensive military capability necessary to bring the extended siege to its conclusion. For the Tyrians, conversely, the sight of Alexander's dramatically expanded fleet, now approaching their previously secure island fortress from multiple directions, with numbers that their own navy, however skilled and experienced, could not realistically hope to match in direct confrontation, must have represented a deeply unsettling recognition that circumstances had shifted decisively and unfavorably against them, setting the stage for the increasingly desperate and technically sophisticated defensive measures that would characterize the siege's subsequent phases, as both sides recognized that the conflict's ultimate resolution was rapidly approaching. With his newly acquired and substantially reinforced fleet of more than 200 warships now assembled and ready for action, Alexander moved swiftly to translate this dramatic reversal in naval strength into concrete strategic advantage against a Tyrian defense that had, until this point, relied heavily on unchallenged control of the surrounding waters to sustain its resistance against the ongoing siege. The sight of this massive combined Macedonian and allied Phoenician naval force approaching Tyre reportedly produced genuine shock and consternation among the city's defenders, who had operated throughout the preceding months of siege warfare under the reasonable assumption that Alexander's military capabilities, however formidable on land, simply did not extend to any meaningful challenge to Tyrian naval supremacy. Faced with this dramatically altered strategic reality, and the very real prospect of a decisive naval engagement against a force that now substantially outnumbered their own fleet, Tyrian naval commanders made the pragmatic, if strategically constraining, decision to withdraw their ships into the relative safety of the city's two protected harbours rather than risk their fleet's destruction in open water combat against Alexander's numerically superior force. Tyre possessed two significant harbour facilities, positioned respectively on the northern and southern sides of the island city, each offering the kind of protected anchorage and defensive fortification that made a direct naval assault against ships sheltering within these harbours a considerably more difficult proposition than engaging the same vessels in open water. Alexander, recognizing both the strategic opportunity this defensive Tyrian withdrawal presented and the corresponding need to prevent the Tyrian fleet from later emerging to disrupt his ongoing operations, ordered his substantial naval force to establish a comprehensive blockade of both harbour entrances, effectively sealing the Tyrian navy within its own protective anchorages and denying the city's ships any opportunity to sortie forth and resume the kind of harassing attacks against causeway construction that had proven so effective during earlier phases of the siege. This blockade represented a significant strategic achievement in its own right, neutralizing what had previously been one of Tyre's most valuable defensive assets and ensuring that the ongoing causeway reconstruction effort could proceed without the constant threat of naval interference that had so severely hampered earlier construction phases. With Tyrian naval forces now effectively contained and unable to interfere with ongoing Macedonian operations, causeway construction resumed with a degree of security and consistent progress that had proven elusive during the siege's earlier stages, when constant harassment from an unchallenged Tyrian navy had repeatedly disrupted and delayed the engineering effort. Alexander's labourers and engineers, now working under the protective cover provided by naval superiority that prevented any repetition of the devastating fireship attack that had so severely set back earlier construction progress, methodically extended the reconstructed and reinforced causeway ever closer to Tyre's formidable walls, finally approaching close enough that the structure could genuinely serve its intended purpose of providing a stable platform from which siege equipment could be brought to bear directly against the city's previously unreachable fortifications. As the causeway finally reached sufficient proximity to Tyre's walls, Alexander ordered the positioning of massive battering rams at its forward edge, powerful siege engines specifically designed to apply sustained, concentrated force against the base of the city's stone fortifications in an effort to create breaches that assault troops could eventually exploit to gain direct access to the island city's interior. This represented the culmination of months of engineering effort and represented, at least in theory, the moment when Alexander's causeway strategy would finally translate into genuine offensive capability against Tyre's previously untouchable defences. The defenders of Tyre, however, proved far from finished in their resistance, demonstrating throughout this phase of the siege the same combination of technical ingenuity and determined resolve that had characterized their defensive efforts from the campaign's earliest stages. Recognizing the serious threat that Alexander's now positioned battering rams represented to their city's walls, Tyrian defenders developed and implemented a creative countermeasure specifically intended to prevent Macedonian ships carrying these heavy siege engines from approaching close enough to the walls to bring their destructive capability effectively to bear. Tyrian forces began systematically dropping massive worked stone blocks into the waters immediately surrounding the base of their city's walls, creating an underwater obstacle field specifically designed to prevent enemy vessels from approaching close enough to position their battering rams for effective use against the fortifications above. This underwater defensive strategy proved genuinely effective, at least initially, in disrupting Alexander's ability to bring his positioned siege equipment into direct contact with Tyre's walls, forcing Macedonian naval forces to maintain a greater distance from the fortifications than would have been necessary for the battering rams to achieve their intended destructive purpose. The resulting standoff illustrated a pattern that had characterized much of the siege up to this point. Each significant Macedonian tactical or engineering innovation was met by a correspondingly sophisticated Tyrian countermeasure, resulting in a protracted, technically demanding contest of military engineering ingenuity between two sides that each possessed genuine sophistication and determination in pursuing their respective strategic objectives. Alexander's response to this new underwater obstacle, however, would demonstrate once again the particular combination of practical problem-solving and relentless persistence that had already carried his forces through multiple previous setbacks over the course of this extended and increasingly technically sophisticated siege. Rather than accepting that these underwater stone barriers represented an insurmountable obstacle to his continued offensive operations, Alexander's engineers began developing specialized equipment specifically designed to address this new defensive challenge, setting the stage for what would become an increasingly elaborate technical contest fought not just above the waterline in the more conventional terms of ancient siege warfare, but beneath the surface of the Mediterranean itself, as both sides deployed increasingly sophisticated methods and equipment in their ongoing struggle to either protect or overcome Tyre's remaining defensive advantages during what was rapidly becoming one of the most technically innovative and hard-fought sieges in the entire history of ancient warfare. The underwater stone barriers that Tyrian defenders had strategically deployed around the base of their city's walls presented Alexander with a genuinely novel military engineering problem, one that required innovative solutions extending beyond the more conventional siege warfare techniques that had characterized most of the campaign's earlier phases. These carefully placed obstacles, consisting of massive worked stone blocks, deliberately positioned to prevent enemy vessels from approaching close enough to bring battering rams and other siege equipment into effective contact with the walls above, represented exactly the kind of creative, technically sophisticated defensive measure that had already characterized Tyrian resistance throughout the siege's earlier stages. Alexander's engineers responded to this challenge by developing specialized equipment specifically designed to remove these underwater obstacles, adapting existing naval and construction technology to address a problem that ancient military engineering had rarely, if ever, needed to solve in quite this particular form. Ships were fitted with large crane-like apparatus, essentially adapted derrick or hoisting mechanisms mounted on vessel decks, specifically engineered to allow crews to lower grappling equipment down to the underwater stone barriers, secure a firm hold on the obstructing blocks, and then use the mechanical leverage provided by these crane systems to haul the offending stones up and out of position, gradually clearing pathways through the underwater obstacle field that Tyrian defenders had so carefully constructed. This innovative approach to underwater obstacle removal proved genuinely effective, allowing Macedonian forces to begin systematically clearing pathways through the defensive stone barriers that had previously prevented siege vessels from approaching close enough to the city walls to bring their battering rams into meaningful operation. The Tyrians, observing this new and unwelcome development, responded with their own creative countermeasure, one that drew on their city's deep maritime traditions and considerable expertise in underwater operations. Tyrian divers, evidently skilled and experienced in the kind of underwater work that the city's extensive maritime commercial activities had presumably required and developed over many generations, were deployed specifically to swim beneath the Macedonian crane vessels and cut the ropes and cables connecting the crane apparatus to the grappling hooks and stone blocks below, effectively severing the mechanical connection that allowed Alexander's engineers to successfully haul the underwater obstacles out of position. This particular tactical exchange between Macedonian engineering innovation and Tyrian countermeasure produced what ancient historians preserve as a genuinely significant technical development in its own right, one whose implications would extend well beyond the immediate context of this particular siege. In response to the Tyrian diver's effective sabotage of his rope-based crane systems, Alexander ordered his engineers to replace the vulnerable ropes with iron chains instead, a solution that proved considerably more resistant to underwater cutting by enemy divers and represents, according to the historical record preserved by ancient sources, among the earliest documented uses of iron chains for this kind of practical naval and engineering application in the entire historical record available to us. This seemingly minor technical adaptation, born from the immediate tactical necessity of countering Tyrian underwater sabotage efforts, illustrates the broader pattern of genuine technical innovation that characterized this siege from its beginning to its eventual conclusion, with both sides repeatedly developing new solutions to novel problems neither had likely encountered in quite this specific form during any previous military engagement. The naval and underwater dimensions of the siege reached a particularly dramatic climax when Tyrian forces, evidently recognizing that their gradually eroding defensive position required increasingly bold and risky countermeasures if they hoped to meaningfully disrupt Alexander's steadily advancing siege operations, launched a surprise naval attack timed specifically to catch Macedonian forces at a moment of reduced vigilance and readiness. Choosing a period when many of Alexander's soldiers and sailors had withdrawn from their positions to take their midday meal, reducing the immediate readiness and responsiveness of the blockading forces surrounding their harbours, Tyrian ships suddenly emerged from their protected anchorages in a coordinated surprise assault specifically targeting the Cyprian contingent of Alexander's substantial allied fleet. This surprise attack achieved genuine initial tactical success, with Tyrian vessels managing to damage or destroy a number of Cyprian ships before Macedonian forces could organize an effective response to this unexpected assault. However, the ultimate outcome of this engagement would demonstrate once again the particular combination of personal courage and decisive tactical leadership that had characterized Alexander's approach to command throughout his entire military career up to this point. Rather than remaining at a safe distance while subordinate commanders organized whatever response might prove necessary to this sudden Tyrian assault, Alexander personally boarded one of his warships and took direct command of the immediate counterattack, leading his forces in an aggressive response that quickly reversed whatever initial advantage the surprise Tyrian assault had managed to achieve. Alexander's direct, personal naval leadership during this engagement proved decisive, with Macedonian forces under his immediate command successfully encircling and cutting off the retreat of the attacking Tyrian vessels, effectively destroying the Tyrian navy's remaining meaningful offensive capability in a single, decisively fought engagement. This naval victory represented a crucial turning point in the broader course of the siege, as it eliminated once and for all any realistic prospect that Tyrian naval forces might mount further meaningful resistance against Alexander's now clearly dominant combined fleet, leaving the city's defenders without their historically most valuable strategic asset, the naval supremacy that had, for so many months, made the very concept of successfully besieging their island fortress seem like such an impossibly ambitious undertaking. With Tyrian naval power now effectively eliminated as a meaningful factor in the ongoing conflict, Alexander commanded, for the first time since the siege had begun many months earlier, truly comprehensive control over sea, air, and land approaches to the city, controlling the surrounding waters through his now unchallenged naval superiority, controlling the causeway and its associated siege equipment that finally provided direct physical access to the previously unreachable island fortifications, and controlling, through his substantial and battle-tested land forces, every avenue by which the city might have hoped to receive reinforcement or resupply from external sources. Alexander began implementing an increasingly sophisticated combined siege strategy, lashing pairs of ships together to create stable platforms capable of supporting particularly heavy battering rams and other substantial siege equipment, allowing these combined vessel platforms to attack Tyre's walls from multiple directions simultaneously, finally bringing the full, comprehensive weight of Macedonian military and engineering capability to bear against a city whose defences, however formidable and however creatively defended throughout the preceding months, were now facing an assault that combined naval, engineering, and land-based military power in ways that even Tyre's substantial resources and defensive sophistication would ultimately prove unable to withstand indefinitely. By the summer of 332 BC, in what had by this point become the 7th month of what remains one of the most technically sophisticated and hard-fought sieges of the entire ancient world, Alexander commanded a comprehensive combination of military and engineering resources that had, through months of persistent effort, creative problem-solving, and repeated adaptation to Tyrian countermeasures, finally positioned Macedonian forces to bring genuinely decisive pressure against the city's previously impregnable defences. The causeway, rebuilt wider and more structurally sound following the devastating fireship attack of earlier months, now extended securely across the water separating mainland from island, providing a stable platform from which substantial siege equipment could operate, with the kind of reliable, sustained access to Tyre's walls that had proven so elusive during the siege's earlier phases. With Tyrian naval power effectively neutralized following Alexander's decisive victory in the surprise naval engagement that had eliminated the city's remaining offensive maritime capability, and with underwater obstacles that had previously protected the base of the city's walls now largely cleared through the innovative crane and chain systems that Macedonian engineers had developed specifically to address this challenge, Alexander judged that circumstances had finally aligned to support a comprehensive, coordinated assault against Tyre's walls, one that would combine every element of the sophisticated combined arms approach that had characterized this entire extended siege from its beginning. Alexander ordered his forces to commence a massive, coordinated bombardment of the city's fortifications, deploying catapults and other substantial siege artillery in a sustained assault specifically intended to identify and exploit whatever weaknesses might exist in walls that had, up to this point, proven remarkably resistant to the various forms of military pressure Macedonian forces had applied over the preceding months. This bombardment continued with sustained intensity, Macedonian artillery crews systematically working across different sections of Tyre's extensive fortifications in search of the particular points where accumulated damage, combined with whatever inherent structural weaknesses might exist in the ancient construction, would eventually prove sufficient to create the kind of breach that assault troops could successfully exploit. This methodical, sustained bombardment eventually achieved its intended purpose. The southern section of Tyre's walls, subjected to concentrated and repeated battering ram assaults delivered from the combined ship platforms that Alexander's engineers had specifically constructed for this purpose, began showing increasingly visible signs of structural failure, with cracks spreading and stones gradually loosening under the sustained mechanical stress of repeated, concentrated impacts. Eventually, after months of siege warfare that had tested every aspect of both Macedonian engineering ingenuity and Tyrian defensive resourcefulness, a section of the previously impregnable southern wall finally collapsed, creating the breach that Alexander's forces had worked so long and so creatively to achieve. Alexander, whose personal leadership style throughout his entire military career had consistently emphasized direct, visible participation in the most dangerous and decisive moments of combat, Rather than remaining at a safe distance while subordinates bore the immediate risks of battle, did not hesitate once this long-awaited breach in Tyre's defences finally materialised. He ordered an immediate, comprehensive assault through the newly created opening, refusing to allow any delay that might give Tyrian defenders time to organise an effective response or attempt emergency repairs to the compromised section of wall. Boarding planks were rapidly extended from Macedonian ships directly into the breach itself, providing the physical access route that assault troops required to move from their vessels directly into the heart of the previously unreachable island fortress. In a demonstration of the personal courage and willingness to share the most immediate dangers of combat that had already become a defining characteristic of his leadership throughout his military campaigns, Alexander himself reportedly led this initial assault personally, becoming among the very first Macedonian soldiers to actually fight his way through the breach and into direct, close-quarters combat within the city that had defied him for so many difficult months. This personal example, consistent with the pattern Alexander had already established during the causeway's construction when he had worked alongside ordinary labourers, rather than merely directing operations from a comfortable distance, carried genuine motivational significance for the assault troops who followed him through the breach, entering into what ancient historians describe as brutal, intense close-quarters fighting as Tyre's defenders, understanding fully that their city's fall now appeared imminent and inevitable, fought with the particular desperate intensity that often characterizes defenders facing what they recognize as a final, decisive engagement. The disciplined, battle-hardened Macedonian phalanx formations poured through the breach with what ancient accounts describe as an intensity fueled by more than mere tactical necessity, carrying with them the accumulated frustration and determination that 7 months of exhausting, technically demanding siege warfare had instilled in soldiers who had endured devastating setbacks, watched months of engineering labour destroyed by Tyrian tactical brilliance, and had persisted nonetheless through Alexander's own relentless refusal to accept that this seemingly impregnable island city might ultimately prove beyond their capability to conquer. Simultaneously with this dramatic land assault through the breached southern wall, Alexander's allied naval forces launched coordinated attacks against both of Tyre's harbour facilities, successfully breaching the defensive fortifications, protecting these critical maritime installations, and establishing additional points of access into the city from multiple directions at once. This coordinated, multi-pronged assault, combining the breach in the main walls with simultaneous naval attacks against both harbours, ensured that Tyrian defenders, however skilled and however determined their continued resistance, now faced an overwhelming combination of military pressure that no single defensive response could adequately address. With Macedonian and allied forces pouring into the city from multiple directions simultaneously in what had finally become the decisive, conclusive assault that would determine the ultimate fate of this remarkable, protracted siege. With Macedonian and allied forces now pouring into Tyre from multiple simultaneous points of entry, the surviving defenders of the city, recognizing the increasingly hopeless nature of their continued resistance against overwhelming and comprehensively coordinated assault, began falling back toward whatever remaining positions might offer some prospect of continued defense, or, failing that, some measure of protection from the fate that now appeared increasingly inevitable given the scale and intensity of the Macedonian assault that had finally broken through defences the city had maintained successfully for so many difficult months. Many of the remaining Tyrian defenders retreated toward the sacred precincts surrounding the city's temples, evidently hoping that religious sanctuary might provide some measure of protection from the kind of comprehensive military violence that ancient warfare typically visited upon cities that had resisted conquest through prolonged, costly siege warfare. Alexander's forces, however, Having endured 7 exhausting and technically demanding months of siege operations, having witnessed the murder of ambassadors that had originally transformed this engagement from conventional military campaign into a matter of personal vengeance for Alexander himself, showed little inclination toward the kind of restraint or mercy that might, under different circumstances, have been extended to defeated defenders seeking religious sanctuary. The historical accounts preserved from this period describe outcomes that reflect the particular brutality that characterized ancient siege warfare, when cities that had inflicted significant casualties and frustration upon a besieging army through prolonged, costly resistance were finally overcome. Driven by accumulated fury over the earlier murder of Alexander's ambassadors, along with the general accumulated frustration of 7 months of difficult, costly siege warfare, Macedonian forces reportedly killed approximately 8,000 Tyrian defenders in the immediate aftermath of the city's fall, a scale of violence that, however disturbing by contemporary moral standards, was consistent with broader patterns of ancient warfare when cities that had resisted siege through prolonged, costly defense were finally overcome by besieging forces. Alexander did extend clemency to certain specific individuals, most notably sparing the life of Tyre's king, along with a number of other prominent officials and citizens who had specifically sought refuge within the temple of Heracles itself, the same god whose worship had originally provided the ostensible pretext for the diplomatic confrontation that eventually escalated into this extended and enormously costly military campaign. This selective clemency, however, existed alongside considerably harsher treatment extended to much of the city's broader population, treatment specifically calculated, according to the interpretation offered by ancient historians recording these events, to serve as a deliberate, highly visible warning to other cities throughout the region who might otherwise have considered similarly defiant resistance against Alexander's continued campaign of conquest. Approximately 2,000 young men of military age, according to the accounts preserved in ancient historical sources, were subjected to crucifixion along the shoreline, a deliberately public and visible form of execution specifically intended to communicate an unmistakable message to any other city that might contemplate resistance against Alexander's forces in the manner that Tyre had so stubbornly and, from the Macedonian perspective, so provocatively demonstrated throughout the preceding 7 months of siege warfare. The remaining population of the city, estimated at approximately 30,000 individuals consisting primarily of women, children, and other non-combatant civilians, were sold into slavery, a fate that, however brutal by any reasonable contemporary moral assessment, again reflected broader patterns common throughout ancient warfare when cities that had resisted conquest through prolonged siege were finally overcome by besieging forces. Having secured this comprehensive, if brutally costly, victory over a city that had once seemed genuinely impregnable, Alexander proceeded to fulfill the original religious purpose that had, months earlier, provided the initial pretext for this entire extended and enormously consequential military campaign. He entered the city and offered the sacrifice to Heracles that he had originally requested permission to perform, completing this religious observance now within a city that existed largely as accumulated rubble and destruction, rather than the proud, prosperous commercial center that had once stood defiantly refusing his initial, seemingly modest request for ceremonial access. The broader historical and even geographic legacy of this remarkable siege extends well beyond the immediate military and human consequences that attended Tyre's ultimate fall in 332 BC. The massive causeway that Alexander's forces had constructed through months of exhausting labor, repeated setbacks, and continuous engineering innovation permanently and irreversibly altered the physical geography of the region in ways that persist to the present day. Natural sediment accumulation around the base of Alexander's engineered causeway occurring gradually over the many centuries following the siege's conclusion, eventually transformed what had originally been a purely artificial military construction into a permanent, naturally reinforced connection between the mainland and what had once been Tyre's isolated island fortress. The modern city of Tyre, located in contemporary Lebanon, exists today on what is effectively a peninsula rather than a true island, a direct and enduring physical legacy of the extraordinary military engineering achievement that Alexander's forces accomplished during those difficult 7 months of siege warfare in 332 BC. Military historians and scholars studying ancient warfare have consistently regarded the Siege of Tyre as representing one of the most remarkable and technically sophisticated military engineering achievements documented anywhere in the ancient world. A campaign that required Alexander's forces to develop and implement innovative solutions to an extraordinary range of novel military and engineering challenges. From the fundamental question of constructing a stable roadway across open ocean water to the more specific tactical problems posed by underwater obstacles, enemy naval harassment, and the need to coordinate increasingly complex combined land and naval operations against an enemy that consistently demonstrated genuine creativity and technical sophistication in its own defensive countermeasures throughout the extended campaign. The siege also offers a particularly vivid illustration of the specific combination of personal qualities that distinguished Alexander's approach to military command throughout his broader career of conquest. An almost obsessive refusal to accept that any obstacle, however seemingly insurmountable, represented a genuine limit to what determined effort and creative problem-solving might ultimately overcome. A willingness to personally share in the most difficult, dangerous, and unglamorous aspects of military campaigning, rather than merely directing operations from comfortable safety, and a capacity for strategic adaptation that allowed him to respond to devastating setbacks, such as the destruction of his initial siege towers through Tyrian fireship tactics, not with discouragement or reconsideration of his fundamental objectives, but with renewed determination and increasingly sophisticated solutions to whatever specific obstacles had proven responsible for previous failures. What began as a seemingly modest request for religious access to a temple, rejected by a proud and confident island city that believed its geographic position and formidable navy rendered it essentially unconquerable, ultimately resulted in one of the most extraordinary and consequential military engineering achievements of the ancient world, an achievement that permanently transformed both the immediate fate of Tyre itself and the broader physical geography of the eastern Mediterranean coastline in ways that remain visible and tangible even today, nearly 24 centuries after Alexander's remarkable causeway first began. Stone by stone, and timber by timber, its slow, determined advance across the waters that had once made Tyre's defiant independence seem so entirely secure.